Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad, back again with my podcast, Capitalism Hits Home. This is a show about the intersection of personal life, emotional life, sexual life, with class, gender, race, and the social fabric of the United States. I hope to educate, to share ideas, to even alleviate some of the burdens that we feel living in the capitalist USA, alleviate them through understanding. Because if one understands what's wrong in the outside world, one doesn't blame oneself. And we are encouraged to blame ourselves in the United States for social problems. We're encouraged to blame ourselves personally. I thought today what I would do is start with definitions, because we often bandy about terms like class, like capitalism, like socialism, like communism, even though we really don't have a precise idea of what they mean. And they can mean different things in different contexts, even though they're not defined. So I want to begin by defining what is class. What is it about? Class is about who produces wealth, goods, services, and who gets to use those services, appropriate those services, and distribute them to different people. So who gets to do the work, and who gets the benefit of other people's work without working her, him, or themselves. There are 5 basic class systems in human history: slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and communism. Now, by each of these systems is really a way of allocating goods and services. And by dividing people into a class of laborers and a class of people who appropriate the labor of other people. There are examples of all of these systems right here in the United States now. If we look at communism, we can look at our early history. Our earliest history as cavemen and women was a history of primitive communism. People couldn't have survived without cooperating. No one was able to get enough so that they could then command other people's labor at first. They shared whatever they foraged from nature. They shared the game that they produced. They had to hunt together and forage together, because one person hunting against a large wild animal wouldn't have worked. But a whole band together, making noise and driving a large animal into a pit that they all dug together, was a communal effort, after which they could communally share what they foraged for in the forests and fields, or what they hunted. So that we all started with primitive communism, early communist societies. Then slightly later, or much later, societies like Native American societies, for example, the Iroquois, was basically a communist society where people shared what they had. Communist societies have an interesting feature in that since everyone is considered an equal participant and sharer, men and women have much more egalitarian relationships. And so that women among the Iroquois were valued as men were. And if a woman wanted to divorce her husband, she just put his belongings outside the tent and he got the picture and went somewhere else. And children were considered a very valuable resource of the whole tribe. They were raised mainly by the maternal uncle and the mother, but also by the whole tribe together, with everyone taking an interest and helping that child because they saw the child as an asset for their future. There's other examples. which are examples of communism that are primitive communism. They're small-scale communism in co-ops. All over the United States, there are co-ops. In California, there's the Arizmendi Bakery and its offshoots where the workers decide what to produce, how to produce it, and how to divide the profits that they get. The largest co-op is a whole city of co-ops in Mondragon, Spain, where there's 104 different co-ops in a city of thousands and thousands of people in Mondragon, where they elect representatives, change representatives, and share what they produce as all these 104 co-ops working together. Another very large co-op, which is remarkable, is the Usha co-op in Calcutta, India, a very poor part of India, which is the sex workers co-op of at least 20,000 sex workers that collectively pool their earnings, share their earnings, and then allocate them. For example, they created their own bank because even though the bankers often had sex with prostitutes, they wouldn't give them a loan. And so they loan each other money to educate their children, to build a home, to start another business, whatever. And they also have communal production of sanitary napkins, of birth control, condoms, and other forms of birth control, so that they are a very, very powerful and wealthy collective, a wealthy commune, a communist organization in a place like Calcutta. The United States, if we're going to look to examples in the United States, let's look at slavery. The slavery we all know about was the slavery of African slaves brought to the United States to labor, for which they got mere subsistence and produced wealth for plantation owners. And other people on the plantation got a share for making sure that these slaves worked very hard and didn't get out of line, like the foreman. There's another form of slavery that is not as well known, of historic U.S. slavery. I never certainly learned about it in my history class, that most American women were brought over to the United States in the earliest period as bondswomen, which is that their passage was paid in exchange for being basically a household slave, a bondswoman, for 7 years, in which they lived with a man, produced his children, did sexual services, emotional services, and child caring services, cooking, cleaning, and so on. And then after 7 years, their bond was paid, and they had permission legally to leave. Many of the owners of bondswomen then married them after that because they got used to having them around. But that's how most women came to the United States in the early days, which was something, of course, I never heard of, that kind of temporary slavery. Another form of slavery that's practiced in the United States now is sexual slavery, where young women are enslaved as sex slaves. They're fooled into coming into a recruiter who then mass rapes them and forces them into sexual slavery. It's estimated, although of course they don't register, so that's not really known, that there are somewhere between 20 and 50,000 sexual slaves in the United States. Capitalism is a system in which class is not divided as it is in slavery between master and slave as property of the master, but rather employer and employee. The employer, the capitalist, hires an employee for a wage which is much less than the work that that employee is worth. To be a good businessman or woman, you can't really pay people as much money as you're getting in your business, or else you're not, quote, a good business person. A good business person gets much more for him or herself and gives the employees less. Of course, in capitalist businesses, some of the expenses of the capitalist are not only for machinery, but also for supervisors, foremen, insurance, and so on. But the basic division is between a waged employee and a capitalist who makes a lot more money than the work that worker is worth and pockets the rest. So, for example, at McDonald's, for a $4 hamburger, a worker gets in McDonald's on average gets $1. Then let's say there's another whole dollar that's put aside for the fry later and so on. Well, then there's $2 for the owner of that franchise, who's making a lot of money off of the labor of his or her employees. And that's considered a good capitalist, when you can make more and you can give your employees less. Socialism is capitalism that's mediated by the government, so that they allow capitalists to go out and make money off of other people's labor, but the government takes a large chunk of that profit that the capitalist makes by levying high taxes and actually collecting those taxes and not allowing businesses and wealthy individuals to evade them like they do in the United States. But socialist states are places like the Scandinavian countries. There are also very strong socialist elements in France and Germany, in which capitalists are regulated. If they get any money from the government, for example, because they had a problem, which they do in recessions, and they have to have workers on the board of directors, they have to have people from the environment groups around the factory or the enterprise, whatever it is, on the board of directors. And no decision can be made without participation. They have to have neighborhood people on the board of directors who have to weigh in on the impact on the neighborhood of this business, so that the capitalist's role is severely curtailed. That's why Germany, the strongest economy in Europe, forbids outsourcing of any kind, just like all the economies of the Scandinavian countries do. So they don't allow capitalists to abandon the workers, the neighborhoods, etc., because the government has a strong control over what capitalists can and can't do. And those taxes that they collect, and they really collect them, are given over to services like universal child care and after-school care, like universal health care, like free universities and free elder care and family subsidy for single parents and so on. They even subsidize the necessities of food and clothing. Families get clothing allowances for school-age children, and especially if they are single parents or parents without money. They even get that in France and Germany. And they also get a single mother in a place like Sweden, gets a lower rent. And even in France, which is not entirely a socialist country but has very powerful socialist elements, no one can be evicted between November and March, because those months are too cold, and so you're not allowed to evict people. Now, what is communism? We know socialism, okay, is capitalism with a powerful state mediator that doesn't allow anyone to escape from high taxes. I should mention that, of course, the United States isn't included, because although we may have taxes on the books, someone like Trump can brag that he doesn't pay taxes. And in the recent revelations from ProPublica, There are years when Jeff Bezos, the richest or among the richest billionaires in the world, Bezos, and also many others like Bloomberg didn't pay any taxes or minuscule taxes on their billions of dollars because in the United States, anyone who has the money to hire a crackerjack corporate lawyer and tax lawyer can figure out ways of evading taxes. Now, what is communism? Communism involves the equal sharing of everything that people work to produce and a communal sharing and decision of what that is. The only really viable communist experiment on a larger scale was the Paris Commune in 1871, which was interestingly the first time where men and women were complete equals, and so were all the races equal in governing and in maintaining that commune. Unfortunately, it only lasted 3 months because one of the things they didn't vote on was maintaining an army, and the French army combined with their former enemies came in. They were both capitalists, they had that still in common, to crush that commune. There's also some communes around the United States, but nothing as big and as total as the Paris Commune. Now, what does this have to do with personal life at home? That's an important question. What do these categories mean for personal life, intimate life in a household? Well, there is slavery. You can have a slave doing your housework who you don't pay, although in the United States, slavery is forbidden and you don't usually, that's very unusual. In some other countries, like India, a child is given to a family that basically enslaves that child as a servant his or her whole life. Now, what we do have, though, is feudalism. What does that mean? How can we have feudalism in the United States? Well, from the very beginning of the United States until the late 1970s, feudalism was practiced in white households. And what do I mean by that? Well, in feudalism, one person, formerly the feudal lord, owned the land, and the serfs worked on that land and gave the lord a portion of what they produced, the larger portion, and kept just enough to barely survive and reproduce, enriching the lord with their labor. Well, in the usual U.S. household, what's called the traditional U.S. household, the male has the house or apartment in his name, and the woman worked to create cleanliness, cooked food, child care, sexual services, emotional services, and the social services of connecting that man to his relatives, to his children, to his friends by inviting them to the house and entertaining them. That system was considered the traditional family, and it was an American family, and no one analyzed it in class terms. But of course, it was a class system of feudalism. It wasn't really, even in 1925, any work that women did that earned anything, the monies had to be given to their husbands. The only money they were allowed to keep was for rural women were allowed to keep the money they sold from making butter and eggs that they sold or bartered with each other. Everything else, any salary they got, belonged to their husbands. And that's why in the traditional marriage vow, The man loves to honor and cherish. He vows to honor and cherish, and the woman to honor and obey. Very different kind of status. And that system exists even now in some sectors. So, for example, in the Orthodox Hasidic Jewish communities and in the Orthodox Catholic community, women are to be in charge of hearth and home. Women are to be subordinate to men. That's even so in the largest Protestant sector, which is the Southern Baptist sector, where women are to be subordinate to men, and men are to be protective of women, and women are not allowed to be in any position dominant of a man. They're not allowed to be the president of a company in which men are employees. They are to keep themselves in a subordinate position. So that those tenets of feudalism to keep women in their lower place serving men are still a strong part of our society. And that only really began to change in the late 70s. And it only changed for white people because Black men could never earn the kind of family wage that could support a dependent wife and children. That's part of the ways that racism kept Black people down. The women always had to work and had a far greater independence than white women had. They weren't destined to cook, clean, provide sexual services, childcare, childbearing, and social services and emotional services for men. They were much more independent. But the mass of people in the United States until the late 70s were overwhelmingly white. That is changing, but that was the case at that time. And Black women have always had to contribute to family support or support themselves and their children. So that feudalism is still alive in our country. It's alive in the taught subordination of women in the household. Because even though our country was supposedly started as a country independent of feudalism, and it was politically independent of feudalism, and it did not have feudal lords and serfs, women were economically in the position of being feudal serfs in the household when they married a man. And unmarried women, who were considered failures because marriage and childbearing were a woman's destiny, and just like the serfs, whose birth meant that they were destined to be serfs, women's gender identity as female meant that they were destined to serve men. And the unmarried sister in a family would move in with her brother or her sister and be a rather degraded person in the household, doing all the least attractive household tasks, because it was a humiliation not to be married. Marriage was a woman's destiny, marriage and childbearing. That has changed radically, except for women in the Hasidic communities who have to serve men in every way and are supposed to serve in evangelical and Orthodox Catholic families, and also supposed to serve in Southern Baptist families. And that is the largest denomination of Protestants. Now, many of the feudal households among the Hasidim or the Orthodox Catholics or the Southern Baptists are what I would call a fascist feudal family. Because under fascism in World War II, under the Nazis and the Italian fascists and the Japanese fascists, women were to serve men in the household. However, because of labor shortages, since they had needed all the men to work at the front, they had to work in factories as well. But because they were considered lesser and because they were supposed to serve men, they were paid much less. And their work was considered much less worthwhile, even though they were compelled to work in order to live. And the toll on women, who were supposed to be reproducing as well, the next generation, as well as working, was so great that even though the Nazis outlawed birth control, a way to control women and women's sexuality and keep them in an inferior position, the birth rate still went down because women were so wiped out by all the burdens that they carried. And so that the kinds of burdens put on women by the Orthodox and by the strict Catholic Church or the Southern Baptists mean that women still have to serve men, but the economy requires them to work. So they have to work outside the home and then come home and do all the work in the home. That's one of the reasons why they have the highest divorce rate in the United States. A state which is sort of like a theocracy, like Utah, among the Mormons who have these same strictures on women's inferiority, has the highest divorce rate in the United States. Of course, there's enough out there that shows women they don't have to do this, that many women choose to get divorced. At any rate, although the United States has not been in a revolutionary period exactly for the last 50 to 60 years, there has been a revolution in the household, a class revolution. And what I will talk about in our next episode is that class revolution and what it means, because the mass of women in the United States have gone from feudalism in the household to either independence in households where they live alone or with their children, or communal households where they share the emotional work, the domestic work, the social work, the child rearing with one another as equals, sharing work in and outside of the household in a communal or communist way. So that will be the next podcast. This podcast was brought to you by Democracy at Work. So thank you all, and remember, please send your feedback. Goodbye for now.